One misplaced decision can unravel centuries of progress. History is filled with moments where a single error, born from pride or panic, didn't just change an event, it rewired the entire trajectory of human civilization. We're exploring 23 ancient mistakes that reshaped our world, from the burning of the Library of Alexandria to a king's desperate betrayal that collapsed an empire's economy. By the end, you'll understand history not as a fixed story, but as a delicate web of choices and consequences, where a wrong turn could erase entire fields of knowledge or redirect the flow of global power. How did the misreading of a comet lead to the fall of a mighty empire? Why would a civilization with the world's greatest navy suddenly abandon the seas? You're about to see how human error echoes across millennia. What do you think is the most costly mistake a society can make? Flames climbed the great scroll shelves of Alexandria, fed by papyrus and parchment that held the wisdom of ages. Julius Caesar, embroiled in a fierce naval battle, had his fleet set ablaze, and the fire did not stay contained to the ships. It leaped onto the docks and found its way to the library, a repository designed to hold all the knowledge in the world. This was not merely a building burning. It was the collective memory of civilizations turning to ash. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of the entire internet being wiped clean in a single catastrophic event. The loss was immeasurable. Works by the greatest thinkers of the Greek world, treatises on mathematics from Babylon, medical texts from ancient Egypt, and astronomical observations from cultures long forgotten, all gone. Among the ashes was the work of Aristarchus of Samos, a man who had deduced that the earth revolved around the sun. His ideas were lost for over 1,000 years, only to be rediscovered and claimed by others much later. The fire did more than destroy paper. It broke a chain of intellectual inheritance. The vibrant center of learning that was Alexandria began a slow decline, and the spirit of open scientific inquiry in the West dimmed for centuries. The course of human progress was forcibly rerouted, all because of a tactical error in a harbor war. This single act of destruction shows how fragile our connection to the past truly is, and how one moment of chaos can erase the work of generations. But this was just the first domino to fall in a long, tragic line. From the ashes of Alexandria, we move to a different kind of destruction, one born not from chaotic accident but from cold, calculated greed. In the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France faced a problem familiar to many rulers. He was bankrupt. His treasury was empty, his wars were expensive, and his primary creditor was not a man but an order, the Knights Templar. These warrior monks were more than just soldiers. They were the financial engine of Europe. They had pioneered a system of international banking, allowing a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem using a coded letter of credit. They were the trusted guarantors of commerce, the most secure financial network the medieval world had ever known, and King Philip owed them a fortune. So he made a choice that would rewire the economic future of a continent. He decided to simply erase the debt by erasing the creditors. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, he launched a surprise attack, ordering the mass arrest of every Templar in France on trumped-up charges of heresy and blasphemy. Under brutal torture, many confessed to the outrageous lies. The order was systematically dismantled. Its leaders, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake, and its vast wealth was seized by the crown. But this was not just a political murder, it was an economic assassination. Philip did not just kill men, he killed an idea. He destroyed the most sophisticated and stable financial institution in existence. The secure roads Templar Knights provided for moving money vanished. Their reliable network of loans and credit crumbled. The sudden vacuum created chaos. Trade became far more dangerous and expensive. Trust, the very bedrock of finance, evaporated. In its place arose a patchwork of smaller, less secure, and far riskier lending practices. This instability left European economies profoundly vulnerable. When the Black Death swept through a few decades later, the economic systems were too fragile to handle the shock, exacerbating the collapse and suffering that followed. The persecution of the Templars shattered faith not only in financial institutions but in the monarchy and the church that sanctioned this betrayal, planting early seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into the Reformation and revolutions. A king's short-sighted desperation to cancel a debt ultimately bankrupted the financial future of medieval Europe, proving that some debts, when avoided, simply come due with catastrophic interest. This pattern of a powerful entity willfully discarding a monumental advantage would be repeated centuries later on the other side of the world. While a French king destroyed a financial system, a Chinese emperor chose to abandon an ocean. In the early 1400s, the Ming Dynasty's treasure fleets were the greatest armada the world had ever seen. Under the command of the legendary Admiral Zheng He, these colossal ships, some reportedly over 400 feet long, dwarfed anything Europe could build for centuries. They sailed from China to the coast of East Africa, establishing trade links, exchanging gifts with local rulers, and demonstrating the immense power and sophistication of Chinese civilization. The potential for a global empire centered in the East was not just a possibility, it was a present reality. And then, suddenly, it was all gone. By the 1430s, the voyages were ordered to cease. The magnificent ships were left to rot in their harbors. The detailed logs, maps, and shipbuilding plans were systematically burned. China, which had gazed outward with unparalleled ambition, deliberately turned its back on the sea. This decision was not made out of weakness but from a shift in internal politics. A new emperor had ascended the throne, and his court was dominated by conservative Confucian scholars. These advisors saw the expensive naval expeditions as wasteful ventures that benefited only merchants and eunuchs, the very admirals who commanded the fleets. They believed true virtue and stability lay within China's borders, in agricultural wealth and traditional values, not in foreign trade and exploration. The court chose isolation over engagement, fearing external influence and internal dissent more than they valued global reach. The cost of this philosophical retreat was astronomical. China voluntarily surrendered its command of the oceans just as Europe was beginning to venture down the coast of Africa. The vacuum of maritime power was immense, and European kingdoms, driven by a desperate hunger for trade routes and wealth, rushed to fill it. Portugal, Spain, England, and the Netherlands began their age of exploration, eventually stumbling upon the Americas and establishing the trade networks that would enrich them for centuries. China, by contrast, stagnated. The cutting-edge technology in navigation and shipbuilding was lost, never to be recovered. The once dynamic economy turned inward and slowly fell behind. Historians often ponder a single, haunting question. What if China had maintained its naval presence, the age of colonization, the distribution of global power, even the primary languages of international trade might look profoundly different today? This was a mistake of supreme confidence, a belief that the world had nothing to offer a civilization that saw itself as the center of everything. It is a powerful lesson on how a nation can be defeated not by outside armies, but by its own inward-looking fears. This refusal to engage with the wider world would find a tragic parallel centuries later, when another great empire, Byzantium, faced a similar choice and made an even more devastating error. A desperate emperor returned to his capital with a promise of salvation, only to be met with the fury of his own city. John VIII had journeyed to the Council of Florence and made an agonizing choice, agreeing to reunite the Eastern Orthodox Church with the Roman Catholic Church in exchange for a desperately needed army from the West. For a ruler staring down the relentless advance of the Ottoman Turks, it was a practical, if painful, decision for survival. But for the priests, the monks, and the ordinary citizens of Constantinople, it was the ultimate betrayal. They believed their emperor had sold their souls, trading their ancient faith for the swords of heretics. The city erupted in protest. The very unity the emperor sought to create was shattered by the people he was trying to save. Clergy denounced the union from their pulpits, and the populace turned against their leader. This internal chaos crippled the Byzantine Empire at its most vulnerable hour. The promised military aid from the West was delayed, then diminished, as the Byzantines themselves could not agree to accept it. The Ottomans, under the young and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, watched this division with keen interest, knowing a house divided against itself cannot stand. When the final siege began in 1453, the defenders were not only outnumbered, they were spiritually broken. The gates of Constantinople fell, in part, because they had been unlocked from within by discord. The consequences were immediate and world-altering. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the Bosporus Strait, the vital land bridge between Europe and Asia, and they immediately choked off the overland trade routes that had fueled European economies for centuries. Spices, silk, and other luxuries from the East became exponentially more expensive and difficult to obtain. This economic pressure is what directly spurred European powers like Portugal and Spain to desperately seek new sea paths to the riches of India and China, launching the great age of exploration that would eventually lead to the discovery of the Americas. In a final, cruel twist, the fall of Constantinople also preserved the ancient knowledge the Byzantines had guarded for a millennium. As the city fell, its scholars fled, carrying with them precious ancient Greek texts that had been lost to the West. This exodus of knowledge and intellect poured into Italy, providing the very fuel that ignited the Renaissance, a rebirth of art and science that would transform Europe. The Byzantine Empire's tragic miscalculation was a failure to see that the greatest threat to a civilization is sometimes not the army at its gates, but the division in its own heart. This pattern of religious conflict reshaping history did not begin in Constantinople, however. Its roots stretch back centuries to another moment of irreversible division. That fracture in the heart of Christendom did not begin with the fall of Byzantium, but centuries earlier, in a conflict of pure, unadulterated politics disguised as faith. For nearly 40 years, from 1378 to 1417, there was not one pope but two. Then, for a brief, absurd period, a third joined the fray. Each man claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ on earth, and each used his divine authority to excommunicate the followers of the other, condemning them to hell. Imagine the sheer chaos for an ordinary believer. Who do you follow? Which mass is legitimate? If you obey the wrong pope, you risk eternal damnation. If you obey the right one, your neighbor might call you a heretic. This was the Great Schism, and it did more than confuse the faithful. It shattered the very idea of a unified spiritual authority in the West. The split was not about theology but raw power. It began when French cardinals, unhappy with the Italian pope in Rome, declared his election invalid and installed their own pope in the French city of Avignon. Suddenly, kingdoms across Europe were forced to choose sides based on political alliances, not piety. France backed its pope. England, forever at odds with France, backed the Roman one. The result was a spiritual civil war that turned religion into a political football. The constant spectacle of two holy men hurling curses at each other from their palaces exposed the church's inner corruption for all to see. The faithful grew cynical, their trust eroded by the blatant power struggle. This widespread disillusionment created fertile ground for reformers like Jan Hus in Bohemia, who argued that the church had lost its way and that ultimate authority lay in scripture, not in a corrupt papacy. Though Hus was burned at the stake for his views, the seeds of rebellion were sown. A century later, Martin Luther would tap into that very same deep well of public anger and frustration. The schism also had immediate, worldly consequences. A divided church was a weak church, unable to muster a unified response to the rising Ottoman threat in the East. It also accelerated the rise of nationalism, as kings and princes saw the Pope's weakness as an opportunity to grab more power for themselves. They began to challenge papal authority over taxes, appointments, and law, slowly chipping away at the Church's temporal power and paving the way for the modern secular state. The Great Schism proved that no institution, no matter how divinely ordained, is immune to the corrupting influence of politics. It was a self-inflicted wound that bled out over centuries, rewriting the religious and political map of Europe. But sometimes the most devastating mistakes are born not from cynical power plays, but from a sincere yet catastrophic failure to understand. A comet streaked across the Mexican sky, and an empire began to unravel. For Emperor Moctezuma II and his priests, the world was a text written by the gods, and every unusual event was a divine omen to be deciphered. In the years before 1519, the signs were terrifying and impossible to ignore. A comet burned a fiery path in the daylight. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, burst into flames without explanation. Fishermen brought in a strange, ash-colored bird with a mirror in its head, and when Moctezuma looked into it, he saw unfamiliar stars and an army advancing. These were not mere superstitions. They were, to the Aztec worldview, direct communications of impending doom, specifically foretelling the return of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, who was prophesied to reclaim his throne from the east. So when news arrived of pale men with beards arriving on floating mountains, armed with thunder and riding strange beasts, it did not look like an invasion to Moctezuma. It looked like a divine prophecy fulfilling itself. His reaction was not one of military preparedness, but of religious awe and paralyzing uncertainty. He sent emissaries to greet these strangers with magnificent gifts of gold and finery, gifts meant for a god. This was the fatal error. Hernan Cortés was not a deity. He was an ambitious conquistador, and he read the lavish gifts not as religious tribute, but as a map to the empire's incredible wealth and a sign of its leader's weakness. Moctezuma's initial welcome granted Cortés and his tiny force of a few hundred men something far more valuable than gold. It gave them time to come ashore, time to assess the political landscape, and most crucially, time to forge alliances with the many subject tribes who deeply resented Aztec rule and were more than willing to help these strange new outsiders tear it down. The Aztec Empire was politically fragile, held together by fear and tribute, and Cortés expertly exploited those fractures. By the time Moctezuma realized his visitors were not gods but mortal men intent on conquest, it was too late. The Spanish were inside the gates, armed with steel, horses, and invisible allies far deadlier than any soldier. European diseases like smallpox, to which the indigenous population had no immunity. The misinterpretation of those omens was a catastrophic failure of strategic thinking. It was a cultural and cognitive trap where a deeply held belief system blinded a leader to a clear and present danger. The result was the swift and brutal collapse of a mighty civilization, the unimaginable wealth of Mexico redirected to Europe, fueling its economies and empires for centuries, and the devastating loss of indigenous knowledge, languages, and cultures on a scale we are still reckoning with today. It stands as a stark lesson of how the stories we tell ourselves can become the very things that destroy us, a theme that would find a powerful echo in the arrogance of an expanding republic that refused to see a threat marching toward them over the Alps. The Roman Senate received the news from Cannae in stony silence. An entire army, some 80,000 men, had been wiped out by Hannibal's smaller, brilliant force. The city was plunged into panic, with mothers wailing in the streets for sons who would never return. Yet when a delegation arrived from Hannibal himself, offering surprisingly reasonable peace terms, the Senate's reply was absolute, defiant rejection. They would not negotiate, they would not even discuss the possibility of defeat. This was not a calculated military strategy, it was an act of pure, unyielding pride. Their rigid belief in Roman invincibility would not allow them to admit a catastrophic loss, even when it was the only logical path to survival. So they doubled down, adopting a brutal war of attrition, a strategy that essentially meant they were willing to lose as many men as it took to finally exhaust their enemy. This stubborn refusal to seek peace prolonged the Second Punic War for another 14 grueling years. The human and economic cost was staggering. Hannibal's army roamed the Italian countryside at will, burning farms and destroying crops. The agricultural heartland of Rome was systematically ravaged. Countless small farmers, the backbone of the Republic's army and its economy, lost everything. Their fields were ruined, and they were forced to abandon their land to seek shelter behind the city walls. This created a profound social shift. Their vacant farms were bought up cheaply by wealthy aristocrats, who consolidated the land into vast estates called latifundia, worked not by Roman citizens, but by the endless supply of cheap slaves captured in the wars that followed. The independent Roman farmer-soldier, the idealized citizen of the early republic, began to vanish, replaced by a landless, impoverished urban poor and a new class of ultra-rich elite. The war, born from pride, forged a new, more professional and ruthless Roman army, but it also broke the old social order. The tensions between the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the disenfranchised, would simmer for decades until they finally exploded in a series of bloody civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Republic itself. Rome's victory over Carthage was so complete that it erased their rival from history, but the cost of that victory was the soul of their own republic. This demonstrates a terrifying paradox: how a nation's greatest military triumph can plant the seeds of its own internal collapse. A similar story of a powerful weapon used without decisive vision would play out centuries later, not with legions but with liquid fire. A weapon that could burn on water was the ultimate naval defense of its age. Greek fire was not merely an incendiary, it was a technological marvel, a closely guarded state secret that gave the Byzantine Empire an almost mythical advantage for centuries. Launched from pressurized tubes on their ships, this viscous liquid would ignite upon contact with the sea, creating an unstoppable wall of flame that clung to enemy hulls and terrified opposing sailors. It was the key reason Constantinople, a city surrounded by water on three sides, repelled countless naval sieges and survived for so long against overwhelming odds. But the Byzantines, in their desperation to protect this singular advantage, made a catastrophic error. They treated the formula not as a piece of technology to be studied and improved, but as a magical relic to be hoarded. Its manufacture was restricted to a single family who passed the secret orally from father to son. No comprehensive written records were kept for fear they would be stolen. This extreme secrecy became its own kind of prison. When that family line eventually died out, or when political turmoil disrupted the careful chain of custody, the knowledge simply vanished. By the time the Ottoman Turks laid their final siege in 1453, the legendary defense was gone. The great chains across the Golden Horn were still raised, but the fire that once protected them was absent. Historians like John Haldon point out that this was a loss for the entire world. Had the principles of Greek fire been documented and shared, even within the empire, chemists and engineers could have refined it. It might have evolved from a terrifying curiosity into the foundational technology of modern naval warfare, potentially altering the balance of power in the Mediterranean for centuries to come. But the Byzantine obsession with secrecy guaranteed its extinction. This is the profound paradox of protectionism, the belief that by locking away an advantage, you keep it safe. In reality, you only ensure its eventual disappearance. The same tragic vanishing act occurred millennia earlier, when an entire civilization's genius for urban planning was buried and forgotten. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were a marvel of the ancient world, laid out in a perfect grid with baked brick houses, sophisticated drainage channels, and public baths that rivaled those of Rome 2,000 years later. This was not a haphazard settlement. It was a meticulously planned metropolis of the Indus Valley civilization, a society that flourished for centuries with a reach spanning over 1 million square kilometers. They had standardized weights and measures for trade, and their focus on communal welfare and sanitation was utterly unique for its time. And then, around 1900 BCE, it all began to fade. A shifting climate, with monsoon patterns growing erratic, and the life-giving rivers like the Saraswati drying up or changing course, slowly strangled the agricultural heart of the civilization. The cities were gradually abandoned, not in a single cataclysm, but in a slow, agonizing retreat from complexity. The greatest tragedy, however, was not the decline itself, but the total evaporation of their knowledge. The Indus script, found on thousands of tiny seals, remains undeciphered to this day, a locked door to their history, their laws, and their engineering principles. When new cultures like the Vedic peoples moved into the region centuries later, they encountered the crumbling ruins of these incredible cities, but had no access to the genius behind them. They were literally living atop a library they could not read. The result was a profound and lengthy dark age. The Indian subcontinent had to reinvent urban living from the ground up. The concepts of city-wide drainage, organized grid layouts, and large-scale public works had to be discovered all over again, a process that took nearly 1,000 years. This loss had dire consequences. The delay in re-establishing complex, fortified urban centers left the region more vulnerable to outside incursions. More hauntingly, as historian Jane McIntosh notes, the disappearance of their advanced focus on sanitation and public health may have contributed to enduring challenges in those very areas for subsequent societies in South Asia. The Indus Valley civilization did not just vanish. Its most brilliant innovations were deleted from human memory, a stark reminder that progress is not guaranteed, and that even the most advanced societies are just one crisis away from being forgotten. This catastrophic loss of collective knowledge finds a chilling parallel centuries later, when another powerful state, Athens, would willfully ignore its own strategic wisdom in a disastrous overseas adventure. Athenian ships crowded the harbor at Syracuse, their sails a forest of misplaced confidence. This was not a simple raid. It was an audacious attempt to conquer the powerful island of Sicily, a gamble born from the intoxicating fumes of imperial ambition. The assembly in Athens had been swayed by the silver tongue of the charismatic Alcibiades, who promised limitless grain, timber, and wealth that would finally crush their Spartan rivals. But the intelligence was fatally flawed. They believed Syracuse was weak and divided, a rich prize for the taking. They could not have been more wrong. The city was a formidable fortress, manned by determined defenders and aided by Sparta itself. The campaign began to unravel almost immediately. Political enemies back in Athens, fearful of Alcibiades' growing power, ordered him to return home to face absurd charges of sacrilege. Instead of facing a sham trial, he defected to Sparta, and in a final, devastating act of betrayal, he provided their enemies with a complete strategic blueprint of the Athenian plan. The campaign descended into a nightmare. The Athenian forces, now led by the hesitant Nicias, found themselves trapped. Their ships were blocked in the harbor, and their army was besieged on land. In a final, desperate naval battle in the great harbor of Syracuse, the Athenian fleet was utterly annihilated. The surviving soldiers attempted a grim retreat inland, only to be hunted down and captured. Nearly 40,000 men were lost, either slaughtered or sold into slavery. The clinking of chains from those Sicilian stone quarries was the sound of Athenian power breaking. The city never recovered its military or financial strength. This catastrophic overreach exhausted its treasury and destroyed a generation of its finest citizens. Within a decade, Athens would be forced to surrender to Sparta, its walls torn down, its empire dissolved, and its golden age of democracy and philosophy brought to a violent close. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the war, saw the root cause not in bad luck, but in a fatal character flaw. It was the arrogance of a democracy drunk on its own power, making impulsive decisions based on emotion rather than reason. The security of the entire Greek world was compromised. With Athens broken and Sparta exhausted by the long war, the stage was left open for a new power to rise in the north. The failure in Sicily did not just doom a city, it cleared the path for the Macedonian conquest of Greece, setting in motion the rise of Alexander the Great. It is a timeless lesson on how the greatest threats to a nation often come not from external enemies, but from its own unchecked hubris. A different kind of arrogance, the dismissive pride of an immense empire, would soon make a similar error when it looked upon a young king from the west and decided he was not a threat. The Persian court looked west and saw only a boy king leading a minor kingdom. To Darius III and his vast empire, Alexander of Macedon was an insignificant nuisance, a reckless youth barely worth their full attention. This was not a simple miscalculation, it was a catastrophic failure of strategic imagination. The Persians were the superpower of the age. Their empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. They possessed immense wealth, a seemingly endless supply of soldiers, and generations of military tradition. When Alexander crossed into Anatolia with a force of barely 40,000 men, the Persian satraps, or regional governors, did not wait for a unified imperial army. Confident in their local superiority, they met him at the Granicus River and were promptly annihilated by the Macedonian phalanx and its devastating companion cavalry. This first defeat should have been a screaming alarm, but the Persian high command still refused to see the true nature of the threat. They continued to believe their own numbers alone would eventually drown this upstart. At the decisive Battle of Issus, Darius himself finally took the field with a massive host, so large it could not properly deploy on the coastal plain. He placed himself at the center, surrounded by his royal guard, expecting a traditional battle of attrition, but Alexander did not fight traditionally. He identified a weak point in the Persian line and led a cavalry charge directly at the emperor himself. The shock of this focused, violent assault broke the Persian command. Darius, in a moment of sheer panic, fled the battlefield, abandoning his own family to capture. His flight did more than lose a battle, it shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. The final act came at Gaugamela, where Darius had chosen a wide, flat plain perfect for his chariots and numerical advantage. He even had the ground leveled to facilitate them. But once again, Alexander innovated. He used an oblique formation, refusing his flank to draw the Persian forces out of position, then drove a wedge directly into the gap that opened around Darius. The emperor fled again, and his army collapsed. The core of the Persian mistake was complacency. They fought the last war, relying on methods that had worked against slower, less agile Greek armies in the past. They failed to adapt to Alexander's combined arms tactics, his brilliant use of terrain, and his relentless personal leadership. As historian Peter Green observes, they underestimated not just his army, but his burning, singular ambition. The result was the lightning-fast conquest of the greatest empire on earth. The consequences rewired the ancient world. Alexander's victories funneled the colossal treasuries of Persia into his own campaigns, funding the construction of new cities that became beacons of Greek learning. This fusion of Greek and Persian cultures created the Hellenistic Age, a period of unprecedented exchange in astronomy, mathematics, and art. But this cultural blossoming came at a dire cost: the complete erasure of Persian political autonomy and the subjugation of its ancient traditions. The Persian failure is a masterclass in how empires fall, not because they are weak, but because they are too confident to see the new rules of the game being written right in front of them. This pattern of a powerful state ignoring a looming threat from the north would soon replay itself on an even grander scale, with even more devastating results. The Rhine and Danube rivers were not just borders on a map, they were the very pulse of the Roman Empire, the final barrier between a world of ordered stone and law and the vast, untamed forests of Germania. For centuries, the legions stationed there were the best of Rome, a disciplined force that projected power and maintained a tense but stable peace through a combination of sheer military might and shrewd diplomacy. They played tribes against each other, offered subsidies to friendly chieftains, and responded to any incursion with overwhelming and brutal force. But slowly, imperceptibly, that focus began to drift. The real power, the real money, and the real intrigue were always in the east, in the wealthy provinces, and in the endless political squabbles over who would wear the purple in Rome or Constantinople. The northern frontier, in the eyes of the distant elite, became a backwater, a place to send second-rate troops or troublesome commanders. The intricate web of alliances with the Germanic tribes was neglected. Payments meant to keep chieftains loyal were cut to save money or were pocketed by corrupt officials. This was not a single error, but a slow, compounding series of them, a failure to see that the world beyond the rivers was changing. The tribes were not static. They were coalescing into larger, more powerful confederations like the Goths, the Franks, and the Vandals, learning Roman tactics and trading for Roman steel. They were growing stronger just as Rome was looking the other way. Then the pressure from the east arrived in the form of the Huns, a nomadic force that pushed these now powerful tribes directly against the weakened Roman borders like a tide. The Goths, fleeing the Huns, begged for sanctuary inside the empire. Desperate for new soldiers, Rome agreed but treated them with such contempt and exploitation that they were soon pushed into open rebellion. In the year 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Roman army was annihilated by these very Goths, and the Emperor Valens was killed. It was a shock from which the Western Empire never truly recovered. The frontier was broken. Once the Rhine froze solid in the winter of 406, allowing hundreds of thousands of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi to simply walk across into Gaul. It was over. There were no legions left to stop them. The sack of Rome in 410 was not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it, the final, bloody proof that the heart of the empire was now undefended. As historian Peter Heather explains, this was a catastrophic strategic blindness. Rome failed to adapt to the new political realities on its doorstep, believing the old methods would always hold. The consequences were beyond anything they could have imagined. The unified economic and legal space of the Mediterranean was shattered. Long-distance trade collapsed, cities shrank behind their walls, and the complex infrastructure of aqueducts and roads fell into disrepair. The light of classical learning dimmed, and Europe fractured into a patchwork of warring kingdoms, beginning the period we often call the Dark Ages. It was a devolution from a world of empires to a world of villages, all because an empire forgot that a fortress is only as strong as its most neglected gate. This pattern of a civilization failing to read its own environment, of weakening its foundations through short-sightedness, would be repeated with terrifying precision in the jungles of Central America. The jungle canopy concealed a civilization slowly consuming its own foundations. The Maya of the classic period were masters of their world, constructing soaring limestone pyramids that scraped the sky and developing a written language and a calendar of breathtaking astronomical precision. Their cities like Tikal and Palenque were bustling centers of trade, ceremony, and learning, supported by a complex agricultural system, but their very success contained the seeds of their downfall. To feed a growing population and to build their magnificent cities, they needed vast quantities of wood and plaster. The plaster, in particular, required immense fires to cook limestone, and the fuel for those fires came from the forests surrounding them. They began to clear the land on a massive scale, a process known as deforestation. This single act set off a devastating chain reaction. Without the tree roots to anchor it, the thin, tropical soil began to wash away with every heavy rain, a process called soil erosion. The eroded silt then choked their intricate reservoir and canal systems, which were the lifeblood of cities during the dry season. They were engineering their own drought. The evidence is etched into the geological record. Sediment cores from lakes near ancient Maya cities show a dramatic spike in soil runoff right before the collapse, followed by a layer of drought-tolerant plants, proving the climate grew drier just as their man-made water systems were failing. This was not a single bad harvest, it was a complete environmental breakdown. Crop yields plummeted, famine and disease spread through the population. The social contract shattered. Why would you continue to haul stones for a king who could no longer guarantee you food or water? The political system, already fractured by constant warfare between city-states, completely disintegrated. One by one, the great ceremonial centers were simply abandoned to the jungle. The knowledge they had accumulated, their advanced understanding of mathematics, including the concept of zero, and their complex calendars, dissipated. When the Aztec Empire rose to power centuries later, they built their own civilization without any access to the Mayas' intellectual legacy. They had to reinvent these wheels, a delay that may have made them more vulnerable when the Spanish arrived. The Maya collapse, as scholars like Jared Diamond point out, is not a story of primitive people failing, but of brilliant ones succeeding too well, until they crossed an invisible ecological line they never knew was there. It is a powerful warning that no amount of architectural or intellectual achievement can insulate a society from the consequences of breaking its own environment. This tragic pattern of a civilization outgrowing its habitat would be eerily repeated in the dry canyons of North America. The silence in Chaco Canyon is a monument to what was lost. By the year 1100, this was the bustling heart of the Anasazi world, a cultural and economic hub unlike any other in the American Southwest. They constructed great houses, massive, multi-storied pueblos of precisely cut sandstone blocks, aligned with breathtaking precision to the solstices and lunar cycles. A network of perfectly straight roads, some 30 feet wide, radiated out from this center for dozens of miles, connecting outlying communities to what was clearly a place of immense ceremonial and political power. This was a society of master engineers, astronomers, and architects, a brilliant flowering of culture in a harsh, dry land, and then, within a remarkably short period, it was all abandoned. The great houses stood empty, the celestial observatories fell silent, and the roads led nowhere. This was not a sudden, single catastrophe, but a slow-motion collapse driven by a cascade of interconnected failures. A prolonged, severe drought, likely lasting for decades, gripped the region, drastically reducing the already scarce water supply. To build their magnificent structures and to fuel the fires for cooking and heating, the Chacones cut down the forests of ponderosa pine that covered the surrounding mesas. This deforestation accelerated soil erosion, making it even harder to grow enough food to sustain the dense urban population. As resources dwindled, the social fabric began to tear. Evidence of violence and possibly even cannibalism points to a desperate society turning on itself. The central authority that had coordinated the complex Chaco system lost its legitimacy. Why would you haul timber and stone for a priest king who could no longer make it rain? The people made a choice not to die out but to disband. They dispersed into smaller, more mobile family groups across the Southwest, joining existing communities or founding new ones. In doing so, they saved themselves, but they sacrificed their grandeur, the specialized knowledge required for their advanced masonry, their celestial architecture, and their large-scale political organization could not be maintained in these smaller, survival-focused groups. It simply faded away. As researcher Stephen Lexon argues, the collapse of this centralized hub fragmented an entire cultural world. The trade networks that had moved turquoise, macaw feathers, and ideas across vast distances withered. The vacuum left by Chaco's fall altered the political landscape of pre-Columbian North America for centuries. When the Spanish arrived, they encountered the descendants of these people, living in well-adapted but far less complex villages, with no collective memory of the monumental civilization that had once thrived in the canyon. The Anasazi story is not one of extinction but of retreat. It demonstrates a terrifying truth that a society's greatest achievements can become its heaviest burdens when the environment shifts, and that adaptation for survival sometimes means abandoning the very complexity that defined your success. This failure to adapt stands in stark contrast to another Arctic culture that was thriving right next door, a culture the Norse settlers of Greenland would pointedly ignore. Their longhouses stood defiantly against the Greenland ice, monuments to a fading way of life. The Norse settlers who arrived around the year 1000 were formidable survivors, masters of the North Atlantic. They built churches, raised cattle, and tried to replicate the pastoral Scandinavian society they had left behind. But Greenland was not Iceland, and it was certainly not Norway. As the climate began to cool, ushering in the Little Ice Age, their pastures shrank and their growing seasons shortened. Their cows, a powerful symbol of status and European identity, required more and more precious hay to survive the brutal winters, hay that was becoming impossible to grow. Meanwhile, just beyond their settlements, the Inuit people were not just surviving, they were thriving. They possessed a technology and a knowledge base perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment. They wore tailored sealskin clothing that provided far superior insulation to the Norse woolens. They hunted ringed seals from kayaks in the winter months, a time when the Norse often starved, waiting for the open water of summer. They harpooned walruses and whales from large, open-skin boats called umiaks, accessing a massive source of protein and fat that the Norse largely ignored. The evidence of this cultural wall is stark. Archaeologists find Norse middens, their garbage piles, filled with the bones of their own undernourished cattle and goats. In the later layers, they even find the bones of dogs and the remains of seals, but they were clubbed on the ice like the Norse did in Iceland, a far less efficient method than the Inuit winter hunting. They were starving in the midst of plenty, surrounded by a solution they refused to see. Why would a people famed for their resilience be so stubborn? Historians like Jared Diamond point to a deep cultural chauvinism. To the Norse, the Inuit were skraelings, a derogatory term meaning wretches or barbarians. Their different language, their different spiritual beliefs, and their different technology made them seem primitive in Norse eyes. Adopting Inuit ways would have meant admitting that their own European identity was inferior, that their Christian God was not providing for them as well as the animistic spirits of the people they despised. This was a price their pride would not pay, so they slowly dwindled, malnourished, isolated from supply ships from Europe that came less and less frequently, and unable to adapt. The last Norse Greenlander died alone sometime in the 15th century. The loss reverberated beyond the extinction of a colony. These settlers had actually reached the coast of North America, which they called Vinland. A successful, adaptable Norse colony in Greenland could have served as a permanent stepping stone, a base for further exploration and colonization of the continent centuries before Columbus. Instead, that door slammed shut. Their story is a haunting lesson in the fatal cost of cultural arrogance, the belief that your way is the only way, even when the world around you is screaming that you are wrong. This tragic refusal to accept outside ideas finds a terrifying parallel in an institution designed to enforce ideological purity at any cost. A royal decree in 1478 did more than establish a court, it built a prison for the human mind. The Spanish Inquisition, sanctioned by Ferdinand and Isabella, began as a tool to enforce religious unity in a newly unified Spain, but its target quickly expanded from converted Jews and Muslims to anyone whose thoughts strayed from a narrow, state-defined orthodoxy. This was not just a religious purge, it was a systematic campaign against curiosity itself. Intellectuals, scientists, physicians, and philosophers found their ideas subjected to the scrutiny of theologians who valued conformity above all else. The atmosphere it created was one of pervasive, chilling fear. A casual remark about astronomy could be twisted into heresy. A discussion of new medical practices could invite a midnight knock at the door. This climate of suspicion made the free exchange of ideas, the very engine of progress, impossibly dangerous. The most brilliant minds in Spain faced a grim choice: silence, persecution, or flight. Many chose to leave. This brain drain, as historians like Henry Kamen have detailed, was a catastrophic hemorrhage of talent. Jewish doctors, Muslim astronomers, and Christian humanists carried their knowledge north to the Netherlands, to Italy, to France, taking with them the seeds of innovation that would blossom elsewhere. While Europe began its ascent into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, Spain stagnated. Its vast wealth, plundered from the Americas, was spent on religious wars and grand cathedrals, not on universities or laboratories. The Inquisition's obsession with purity of faith created a culture that was inwardly focused, suspicious of foreign ideas, and hostile to the critical thinking necessary for scientific advancement. The cost was a delayed enlightenment. Spain, which had the resources and the global reach to lead the world into a new age, instead found itself left behind. its intellectual life frozen in time by the very institution created to protect it. This demonstrates a terrifying principle that the most effective way to cripple a nation is not to attack its armies, but to silence its thinkers. This organized destruction of knowledge finds a brutal, direct parallel in a single act of cultural annihilation thousands of miles away. A pile of painted manuscripts crackled and blackened in the central plaza of Mani. The year was 1562, and the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa watched with grim satisfaction as the accumulated knowledge of a civilization was fed to the flames. He believed he was saving souls by destroying what he saw as the tools of the devil, works brimming with pagan superstition. But these were not simple idols, they were codices, intricate books painted on long strips of bark paper, folded like an accordion. They were the libraries of the Maya, containing their history, their sacred rituals, their intricate astronomical observations, and their understanding of medicine and mathematics. Landa's auto-da-fe was a systematic, deliberate act of cultural annihilation. He was not a lone fanatic, but part of a broader missionary campaign that saw the indigenous written word as a threat to be extinguished. In a single, fiery afternoon, centuries of intellectual achievement were reduced to ash. Only 4 of these codices are known to have survived the conquest, a tiny, fragmented window into a lost world. The scale of the loss is almost incomprehensible. Imagine trying to reconstruct the entirety of Western philosophy, science, and history using only 4 randomly selected books. That is the task facing Mayanists today. The Dresden Codex, for instance, contains incredibly advanced Venus tables, tracking the planet's cycles with stunning accuracy for centuries into the future. What other discoveries, what other complexities of thought were lost in those fires? As archaeologist Michael Coe has argued, this was a tragedy on par with the loss of the Library of Alexandria. But the damage went deeper than lost knowledge. The destruction of the codices was a direct attack on the Mayas' connection to their own past. It severed the chain of memory that linked them to their ancestors, their gods, and their understanding of the cosmos. It made it exponentially easier for the Spanish to impose a new religion, a new language, and a new identity, accelerating a cultural erasure that echoes through the generations. This was more than vandalism. It was a willful decision to unwrite a people, to silence their voice in the grand narrative of human history. It stands as a stark monument to the danger of any ideology that believes it must destroy the past to control the future. This fear of new ideas, of the disruptive power of knowledge, would soon manifest in a different empire, one that saw a revolutionary machine not as a tool for enlightenment, but as a threat to its very soul. A decree from the Ottoman Sultan banned the printing of books in Arabic script, a decision that would echo for centuries. Just as the Spanish Inquisition had silenced thinkers, the Ottoman Empire chose to restrict the very technology that was fueling a revolution in Europe. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, was not an unknown marvel in Istanbul. Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Europe had even brought presses with them and were allowed to print books in Hebrew and other languages. But when it came to the sacred Arabic script of the Quran, the ruling elite saw only danger. A powerful coalition of conservative Islamic jurists and the influential scribes' guilds argued fiercely against it. The jurists feared that mass-produced texts potentially filled with errors could corrupt the holy words of Islam and spread unapproved interpretations. The scribes, whose entire livelihood depended on the meticulous and expensive art of hand-copying manuscripts, saw the press as an existential threat to their craft and status. So the Sultan yielded to this pressure and the ban was put in place. It was a choice made for stability, for preserving tradition, and for protecting powerful interests. But the cost of that stability was a slow, invisible stranglehold on the empire's intellectual life. While books poured off presses in London, Paris, and Venice, spreading new ideas in science, philosophy, and geography at an unprecedented pace and plummeting cost, the Ottoman world remained reliant on the slow, expensive, and error-prone process of handwritten manuscripts. Knowledge became a luxury item, accessible only to a tiny, wealthy elite. The vibrant exchange of ideas that was electrifying European coffee houses and universities was simply impossible. There was no equivalent of the cheap pamphlet that could spread a revolutionary scientific theory or a new political idea to the masses. As the historian Bernard Lewis argued, this technological hesitation created a profound and growing gap. European navigators had access to constantly updated, printed maps. Ottoman captains did not. European armies developed new tactics disseminated through printed manuals. Ottoman officers relied on tradition. The scientific revolution, built on the rapid sharing of peer-reviewed findings in printed journals, largely passed the empire by. This was not a matter of intelligence but of access. By the time the ban was finally lifted in the 18th century, the gap in innovation and military technology had become a chasm that the empire could never close. It is a stark lesson in how the fear of disruption can be more damaging than disruption itself, a lesson that would be repeated in an empire that saw intricate machines as nothing more than amusing toys. A gleaming mechanical clock chimed the hour in the Forbidden City, a marvel of European engineering presented as a gift. Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricks, I brought these intricate devices to the Ming and Qing courts, hoping to win favor by demonstrating Western scientific achievement. The imperial reaction, however, was not what they expected. The Chinese elite admired these automata as fascinating curiosities, wonderful toys for the emperor's collection. They were seen as clever novelties, not revolutionary tools. This dismissive attitude was rooted in a profound cultural confidence. China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the pinnacle of civilization, with a vast body of traditional knowledge that had served it perfectly for millennia. The intricate gears of a clock were amusing, but they did not represent a form of knowledge superior to their own. The focus remained on Confucian classics and literary arts, the true markers of a cultured man, not on the manual crafts of mechanics and engineering. This was a catastrophic misreading of the clock's significance. In Europe, the relentless drive for precision timekeeping was fueling a revolution. It was enabling accurate navigation for ocean-going ships, synchronizing complex factory operations, and providing the exact measurements necessary for scientific experimentation. The clock was not a toy, it was the heartbeat of a coming industrial age. Because the Chinese court saw no urgent need to integrate these technologies into their own industry or naval development, they failed to reverse engineer them, to improve upon them, or to build an entire ecosystem of precision manufacturing. As historian Joseph Needham's work reveals, China had itself been a technological powerhouse, inventing gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and advanced astronomical instruments centuries before Europe. But a social structure that prized scholarly achievement over artisan craftsmanship meant these innovations often remained isolated wonders, not the foundation for systemic progress. The failure to see the clock as a key to a new world meant that when the Industrial Revolution did arrive, China was a spectator, not a participant. This left them dangerously vulnerable in the 19th century, unable to compete economically or militarily with the very nations whose technology they had once dismissed as amusing trifles. It is a powerful lesson in how cultural pride can blind a society to the tools of its own transformation. a mistake that would be mirrored in the overconfidence of a European army on an African plain. Red-coated soldiers stood in tight formation on the open plain of Isandlwana, supremely confident in their volley fire and modern Martini Henry rifles. They were the British Empire's finest, and they faced what their commander, Lord Chelmsford, had assured them was a disorganized mob of primitive savages armed with spears. This was a catastrophic misjudgment, a failure of intelligence born from deep-seated racial and cultural arrogance. The Zulu Impi was not a mob. It was a highly disciplined, brilliantly organized military machine, honed by decades of warfare and led by tactical geniuses like Ntishingweo Kamahol. The British had camped without fortifying their position, scattering their forces and leaving their ammunition boxes locked and difficult to open, all because they could not conceive of a real threat from the Zulu. They were so assured of their superiority that they did not even bother with basic defensive precautions. Then the horns of the buffalo encircled them. The Zulu attack was not a wild charge. It was a masterful pincer movement with a central force engaging the British front while two flanking horns swept around to surround them completely. The disciplined British volleys initially inflicted heavy casualties, but the Zulu warriors, driven by discipline and the need to purify their spears, kept coming. They closed the distance, and the battle dissolved into close-quarters combat where the stabbing Ikulwa spear was devastatingly effective. In a matter of hours, the impossible happened. A force of around 20,000 Zulu warriors had annihilated a British column of over 1,300 men. It was one of the worst defeats in the history of the British Empire. The shockwave from Isandlwana reverberated across the colonial world. As historian Saul David explains, it was a brutal reminder that technological superiority was meaningless without respect for an enemy's tactics, terrain, and motivation. The British were forced to completely reassess their approach to colonial warfare, abandoning their arrogant assumptions and adopting new, more cautious tactics to eventually win the war. But the consequences ran deeper than military reform. The war intensified British resolve to control southern Africa, leading to more conflicts and the eventual subjugation of the Zulu kingdom. This brutal conquest and the land dispossession that followed planted some of the deepest seeds of the racial and political tensions that would, decades later, solidify into the system of apartheid. A commander's dismissive prejudice on a single afternoon had helped rewire the fate of an entire region, proving that underestimating an opponent is often the first step toward your own defeat. This failure to accurately assess a threat to prepare for the battle ahead instead of the last war would find a chilling and concrete expression half a century later in the fields of France. Concrete and steel snaked along the French border, a monumental testament to the memory of the last war. The Maginot Line was the most sophisticated and expensive defensive system ever built, a deep underground network of forts, artillery casemates, and living quarters designed to make a repeat of the horrific trench warfare of World War I impossible. It was a solution to the previous problem, a masterpiece of military engineering built to fight the last war, and that was its fatal flaw. French strategic thinking became frozen in time, anchored to the belief that any future conflict would be a slow, grinding battle of attrition where this impervious wall would force the German army to break itself upon the fortifications or push through neutral Belgium, where the French army planned to meet them. This reliance on a static defense bred a dangerous complacency, a belief that they were safe behind their concrete shield. They failed to grasp that warfare had evolved. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was not about attrition. It was about speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, using tanks and aircraft not as support for infantry, but as a concentrated spearhead to slash through enemy lines and cause total chaos in the rear. The French High Command, as historian Julian Jackson notes, was dominated by generals who were mentally unprepared for this new form of mobile warfare. They dismissed the thick, hilly Ardennes forest to the north of the Maginot Line as impenetrable to a large modern army, a catastrophic intelligence failure. In May 1940, that is exactly what General von Manstein's panzer divisions did. They poured through the weakly defended Ardennes, a move the French considered impossible, and raced across the undefended French countryside behind the Maginot Line. The French army, trained for a static fight, was completely outmaneuvered. Their best units were cut off in Belgium, and the entire command structure collapsed in confusion. The Maginot Line itself was never breached. It was simply rendered irrelevant, a billion-dollar monument to a war that would never be fought. The swift, shocking fall of France reshaped the entire world. It left Britain isolated to face the Nazi threat alone. It delivered the immense industrial and agricultural resources of France into German hands, and it emboldened Hitler to launch his invasion of the Soviet Union. The collapse also shattered the myth of European invincibility in its colonies, accelerating decolonization movements across Africa and Asia. This was more than a tactical error. It was a failure of imagination, a lesson that preparing for the past is the surest way to lose the future. This pattern of a rigid system failing to account for unpredictable disaster would soon be tested in the most terrifying way possible, not on a battlefield, but inside a nuclear reactor. Radiation sensors in Sweden began screaming, detecting a massive spike in atmospheric pollution. But the source was a mystery until the wind patterns pointed unequivocally east toward the Soviet Union. In a Moscow office, a bureaucrat received the urgent international inquiry and faced a choice to tell the truth or to protect the state's image. The choice had already been made. For nearly 2 days after the explosion at reactor number 4 in Chernobyl, the Soviet government said nothing. The world knew something was catastrophically wrong, but the people living in the shadow of the plant in the city of Pripyat were told it was a minor electrical fire. Children played outside in the radioactive fallout, breathing in invisible poison. The first busloads of evacuees did not leave until 36 hours after the meltdown, a critical delay that doomed thousands to higher doses of radiation and future cancers. This was not a simple error in public relations. It was the product of a system built on secrecy, where the illusion of control was always more important than the truth. The initial instinct was to contain information, not the radiation. Reports were classified, doctors were forbidden from diagnosing radiation sickness, and the official death toll was kept absurdly low. But the truth, like the radioactive particles, could not be contained. It seeped out through ham radio operators, through the brave journalists who defied censorship, and through the undeniable evidence of the massive concrete sarcophagus being built over the reactor. The Soviet people and the world watched in horror as the full scale of the incompetence and the cover-up became clear. As historian Serhiy Plokhy argues, Chernobyl shattered the central myth of the Soviet state, that the party was a rational, scientific vanguard that could manage everything for the good of the people. Instead, it was revealed as a corrupt, brittle bureaucracy that would rather let its citizens die than admit a mistake. This single event became a powerful catalyst for Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness, because the old ways of secrecy had demonstrably failed. The global impact was just as profound. The images of the abandoned city of Pripyat, a modern ghost town frozen in time, fueled anti-nuclear movements across Europe and the United States, leading to stricter international safety protocols and a deep public skepticism toward nuclear power that persists to this day. The Soviet handling of Chernobyl is the ultimate lesson in how a failure of transparency can transform a disaster into a catastrophe, proving that a government's greatest weakness is not its inability to control a reactor, but its refusal to control its own instinct to lie. This pattern of a rigid system refusing to see a clear and present danger finds its most ancient and symbolic expression in a story we all think we know, a story of a wooden horse and a fatal misjudgment. The Trojans saw a masterpiece of wood, not a masterpiece of deception. After a decade of brutal siege, the Greek army had vanished from the plains outside Troy, leaving only this strange, silent offering. To the exhausted defenders, the colossal wooden horse appeared not as a threat, but as a tribute to the gods, a sign that their enemies had finally given up and sailed for home. They ignored the frantic warnings of the priest Laocoon, who famously cried that he feared the Greeks even when they bare gifts. They dragged the horse through their impregnable gates and into the heart of their city, celebrating what they believed was their hard-won victory. That night, while Troy slept, the hidden compartment in the horse's belly opened. A small, elite force of Greek soldiers slipped out, unlocked the city gates for their returning army, and unleashed a slaughter that ended a civilization. The story is a legend, but as historian Michael Wood suggests, it captures a profound and recurring truth about Bronze Age warfare, where a clever ruse could achieve what years of frontal assault could not. The mistake was not one of strength, but of perception. It was the ultimate failure of vigilance, a lowering of guards at the precise moment when caution was most critical. This ancient tale is a perfect mirror for 1,000 historical deceptions, from the false treaties that lulled native populations into a fatal sense of security, to the elaborate disinformation campaigns used by spies to blind their enemies. The Trojan horse is the eternal symbol of a too-good-to-be-true offer, a lesson that the greatest threats often arrive not with a declaration of war, but wrapped in the guise of a gift. It is a warning about the seductive power of our own desires, how our longing for an end to conflict can make us blind to the danger hiding in plain sight. This final era brings our journey full circle, from the burning of knowledge to the breaching of walls, a timeless reminder that the most devastating mistakes are not always acts of commission, but failures of imagination, where we see only what we wish to see. These ancient echoes are not locked in the past. The same forces that toppled empires and erased knowledge are at work in our boardrooms and governments today. We face our own cascading challenges, from a rapidly shifting climate to the dizzying pace of artificial intelligence. The refusal of the Ming Dynasty to engage with the wider world finds its parallel in modern industries that ignore disruptive technologies until it is too late. The Byzantine obsession with hoarding the secret of Greek fire mirrors the dangers of corporate secrecy that stifles innovation and leaves entire companies vulnerable. And the catastrophic misreading of Omens by Moctezuma is a stark warning for our era of information overload, where we must constantly discern real threats from digital noise. The core patterns are timeless, a recurring cycle of hubris, fear of change, and a stubborn failure to adapt to new information. So what is the antidote that history prescribes? It is the courage to embrace diversity of thought, to prioritize radical transparency over convenient secrecy, and to foster a culture of continuous learning. Progress has never been a straight line. It is a constant, often uncomfortable process of course correction. It requires the humility to admit when we are wrong and the flexibility to change direction, just as the survivors of Choco Canyon did when they chose to disband and adapt rather than perish. These 23 mistakes are not just tales of failure. They are a collective manual for resilience. They teach us that the most valuable resource any society possesses is not its gold or its armies, but its ability to learn, to listen, and to evolve. By understanding these ancient stumbles, we arm ourselves with the wisdom to navigate our own precarious moment, to build systems that are anti-fragile, and to shape a future that learns from the echoes of the past. From the ashes of the Library of Alexandria to the silence of Chernobyl, these 23 ancient mistakes remind us that history is not just a record of triumphs, but a long chronicle of blunders that permanently rewired our world. Each error born from arrogance, fear, or a simple miscalculation set off chain reactions that bent the arc of human progress in ways we are still living with today. A king's greed could shatter a continent's economy, an emperor's pride could surrender an ocean to rival powers, and a general's overconfidence could topple a golden age. These were not isolated events, but critical failures in a complex system, moments where a single cracked link broke the entire chain. As we navigate our own complex era of rapid change and global connection, let these stories serve as a powerful call for vigilance, for adaptability, and for the profound humility required to learn from the past. Remember, the next world-changing mistake might be unfolding right now, and it could be avoided if we choose to heed these ancient echoes. If you found this journey through history's pivotal stumbles enlightening, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which mistake you believe had the most profound and lasting impact. Subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our present, and until next time, stay curious and always learn from the errors that shaped us.